Hello again, I'm Swick, and in this video we'll be talking about how to identify and analyze rhetorical choices. More specifically, we'll look at the different types of rhetorical choices, including argument choices, structural choices, and stylistic choices, and then I'm going to show you how to analyze them for the AP exam. So let's start simple. What is a rhetorical choice and why should we care? A rhetorical choice is any intentional move a writer makes in their writing that's going to affect their audience. Basically, when a writer sits down to write something, they think about how can I persuade my audience? Anything they include in their writing to achieve that would be a rhetorical choice because they are making choices about their rhetoric. The reason that we care I've mentioned before in previous videos. It's important that we can read critically. And that means we know when someone is using tricks, language, organizational structure to persuade us. It doesn't mean we can't be changed by those things, but we should always be aware of what a writer is doing and why they're doing it. The ability to analyze rhetorical choices is a core skill that will appear throughout your AP exam. For example, in the multiple choice, you'll often be asked questions about the different rhetorical choices a writer might make in their passage, or its intended effect on the audience. Then, in the writing portion for question 2, you will write an entire rhetorical analysis essay in which you look at a passage, identify rhetorical choices, and analyze or explain what effect those choices have on the intended audience or how they support the writer achieve their purpose. Now, the term rhetorical choices covers a wide range of different strategies and tools writers use to appeal to their audience. For our purposes, I'm going to divide it out into 3 categories. First, choices that the writer makes about their argument itself. Second, structural choices, or choices the writer makes about organization. And third, stylistic choices, or choices that the writer makes about the language they use and how they express their ideas. Let's start by talking about how we identify these choices in a passage. And as I mentioned, the first category we're going to talk are choices about argument, or choices about how an argument is being approached. Of the 3 subcategories of rhetorical choices, the argument category is probably the broadest, but we're going to talk specifically about appeals, ethos, pathos, and logos. That said, I want to be very clear that there are a lot of more rhetorical choices that fall into this category, such as asking rhetorical questions, making allusions or references to something outside the text, challenging ideas, anticipating objection, implications, predictions, proposals are all different types of rhetorical choices that fall under that idea of argument and how to approach that argument. But we're specifically going to dig into the rhetorical appeals, ethos, pathos, and logos. So let's start with the rhetorical appeals, ethos, pathos, and logos. The reason I'm starting and focusing here is because ethos, pathos, and logos appear in almost every persuasive passage you encounter. They're very useful when it comes to question 2 of the exam because the passages that you'll have to analyze for your rhetorical analysis essay often have examples of all 3. But let's get started with pathos. Pathos is an appeal to emotion. And I have a symbol of a heart because most people associate it with tugging at the heartstrings or making an audience feel sad. That is true, and that's a very common example of pathos, but pathos is broader than that. It's appealing to any emotion. So it can appeal to the fear of an audience. It can appeal to the nostalgia of an audience. Pathos is really just any type of appeal to a specific emotion. And that's why when you're looking for it, it's very important that you can identify what is that specific emotion that's being appealed to. Logos is the logical appeal. This means that the writer is typically using facts, numeric information, statistics in order to prove their point. That's because they are making a logical or rational appeal. And the final one, ethos, has taken on multiple definitions over the years, but at its core, the word ethos is similar to the word character in Greek. So essentially what this can look like in a passage is when the writer does something to establish their own credibility. So this can mean that they are bringing in outside information like an expert opinion, but it can also be building their own character or their own credibility in terms of proving that they are a source worth listening to. So when we say ethos, while it can just be establishing credibility with testimonial and expert opinions, it can also be efforts made by the writer to bolster their own credibility by showing their own good moral character. All right, let's practice identifying the rhetorical appeals, ethos, pathos, and logos. On the next 3 slides, I have 3 advertisements, 1 example of each. In your notes, identify which appeal you think that advertisement is an example of and explain your answer. It may help to take screenshots of the ads and put them in your notes if you're working digitally. Like I said, there are a great number of other choices that fall under this argument category of rhetorical choices. I'll show you some more later in the video when I do a full annotation. But for now, let's move on to structural choices. The second category of rhetorical choices that we're going to explore in this video are structural choices. These are choices that the author makes about how they want to organize or sequence their ideas. Just like with our argument category, there is a long list of choices that can fall under this structural or organizational category. Today, I want to focus on methods of development. Methods of development are common structures that writers use to be persuasive. The examples I have listed are narration, definition, description, cause-effect, and compare-contrast. You've likely seen all of these in different contexts. But another structural choice that's commonly used is repetition. The good thing about repetition is it's usually pretty easy to identify. The trick is being able to analyze it. So for this portion of the video, we're going to dig into these types of choices. One important distinction about a method of development is that it usually spans over a section of a passage, not typically just a single line. While a writer might make a quick comparison or do a quick cause and effect within a sentence, typically methods of development span larger portions of the text. For instance, a single line of description isn't usually a structural choice. Instead, it's more likely going to be a paragraph or a section that goes into great detail describing something. The reason I make that distinction is it can be confusing because sometimes a writer is just describing something quickly, right? But when we're talking about it as a method of development, it's usually going to be more substantial. Let's look at an example. The following paragraph is an example of compare-contrast. You can't control your fate. The truth of these words for Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy drive the paths of their lives. However, how each different boy's fate unfolds is what makes one considered the hero and the other a villain. Harry Potter is destined to be the chosen one. He did not choose this destiny, but it was thrown on him as a child because of how events unfolded for his family. On the other hand, Draco Malfoy has family expectations of siding with or supporting the Death Eaters because of his father's affiliation. Failure to follow Voldemort could lead to not only his death, but that of his family. This is a great example of compare-contrast. In this one, it's comparing the two characters from the Harry Potter series, Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy. It identifies some things they have in common, but more importantly, what's different about them. So, for example, Draco was born into a family with affiliations to the Death Eaters. That is in contrast to the family situation that Harry had. Therefore, this is a great example of compare and contrast. Let's do a quick practice identifying which method of development this example has. In your notes, identify the method of development and then explain why you think this is a good example. It might help to pause the video. And that is our very quick introduction to methods of development. As you're reading passages from the multiple choice portion of your test, or for question 2 on the written portion of the exam, make sure that you're paying attention to see if any of these methods of development appear. Like I said, if it's a substantial or significant portion of the text, like an entire section, it's definitely a deliberate choice by the writer that you can analyze for purpose. Also, as mentioned, keep an eye out for repetition and be sure that you're looking for things that are purposeful and intentional. The third category of rhetorical choices are stylistic choices. This refers to choices that the writer makes about the language they use and how they express their ideas. For this portion of the video, I'd like to focus on tone or tonal shift analysis. Tone is the speaker's attitude, and throughout a passage it can change, which is called tonal shift. The reason we're focusing in on this one is, again, it's a great rhetorical choice that you can analyze in almost any passage for question 2. So when we talk about tone and revealing a speaker's attitude, it's really done through two things. 1, diction or word choice, and 2, syntax or sentence variation or sentence structures. These two things work together to reveal a speaker's attitude or the tone. Let's start with diction. Diction refers to the connotative meaning of the language or the emotional reaction that an audience has to certain word choice. Think of it this way. Consider a time where you had to write a post for social media, maybe an email to a teacher, and you wanted to choose your words very carefully. In this case, you were thinking about your diction or your word choice. And when writers sit down to write persuasive passages, a successful or effective writer will often think about using the best word choice to achieve their purpose and to reveal the right tone. Now, the challenge when identifying diction or tone is that you need to be able to describe it very specifically. It's overly simplistic to say that the writer has a mad tone. Instead, you want to find the exact right word to describe the diction that they've used in their passage. On the screen, I've created a chart to illustrate this. At the top, I have the word disappointed. If I were to say, I'm disappointed in what you did, that will elicit a certain reaction from you. Versus the next word, if I said, I'm hurt by what you did, that might elicit more remorse or guilt. Finally, if I were to say, I'm devastated by what you did, that's probably going to have a much stronger reaction than the other two. As a writer, you want to choose the exact right word. And when we're analyzing, we want to be able to describe the diction or the tone using a very specific descriptor word like one of these. So when it comes to analyzing tone or diction, it really comes down to having the right word to describe the passage. So let's practice using a similar diagram to the last slide. At the top, I have annoyed, and at the bottom, I have enraged. Consider this. You're reading a passage, and you're trying to identify the exact right word to describe the diction. But annoyed isn't strong enough, and enraged is too exaggerated. What word would be the best to fit in the middle? In your notes, fill in the blank and describe why that word would be a good fit right between annoyed and enraged. Now let's practice analyzing a passage for diction and tone. Here's an example of a short excerpt that reveals tone. Whenever he was so unfortunate as to have near him a hare that had been kept too long, or a meat pie made with rancid butter, he gorged himself with such violence that his veins swelled and the moisture broke out on his forehead. To begin, I've highlighted some words that I think are examples of deliberate word choice. Words like rancid, gorged, violence, and swelling veins all create a very distinct picture. Therefore, if I was to do a tone analysis on this passage, the tone that I would identify would be disgusted. Clearly, the speaker has an unfavorable attitude towards the subject of this passage. It describes him eating rancid food, that he gorges himself violently, that his veins swell and he sweats. In other words, the speaker is clearly a little disgusted by this person. Therefore, the tone is disgusted. Now let's talk about syntax, which can also be used to reveal author's tone. Syntax refers to sentence structures or patterns in the sentence structures. Therefore, what we would be looking for are the sentence types. Are they declarative, exclamatory, interrogative? Meaning, are they statements, questions, exclamations? We also look at the sentence lengths, short versus long. And we also look at the sentence structures. Are they simple? Are they compound sentences? Are they complex sentences? Really what we're looking for when we're doing a syntax analysis is we're looking for patterns, and sometimes more importantly, where the pattern changes. As mentioned, analyzing syntax is really about looking for patterns, or more importantly, where a pattern changes. On the screen, I have an excerpt from a speech that Queen Elizabeth, and I mean the one from a million bajillion years ago, gave before troops went to battle. In it, I've identified one particular sentence. See if you can identify the pattern or the change in pattern that I'm recognizing. Hopefully, you notice that this is the only short declarative sentence in the entire excerpt. The sentences surrounding it are longer, more complicated, and compounded in structure. What this does in the passage is creates emphasis on the one single short sentence. Therefore, if I were to do an analysis of the syntax in this passage, I would point out how Queen Elizabeth is focusing on the tyranny of their opposition. Because they're going into battle, she wants to inspire them to take that tyrant down. And so she uses a variation in her sentence structure to emphasize that line. So when we're analyzing syntax, it can serve a number of functions. First, like in this example, it can create emphasis. It can also reveal the tone of the speaker. It can also alter the pace and more. By being able to identify these functions of syntax in a passage, we can usually create a rich analysis of how that is contributing to the author's overall purpose, which is exactly what you do in question 2 of the written portion of the exam. So in summary, analyzing diction and syntax helps you identify tone. That alone is something you can analyze on question 2. But you can also analyze something called tonal shift. Tonal shift occurs when the passage has multiple tones or it goes from one tone to another. And that usually can take on 2 forms. One, the tone might shift in intensity. So if we're going back to our previous examples, the beginning of a letter or message might just sound a little annoyed. However, by the end, there might be a shift, and that writer might be enraged by the time they finish the note. That would be an example of tonal shift, and I would explain why that shift happened and how it served their function in a question to or in my rhetorical analysis essay. Another way that tone can shift is in its neutrality. A lot of times, writers will start off more neutral before getting into their persuasive or their more direct argument. This is also tonal shift. I might start out very matter of fact, stating what happened and here's what I saw. But then I might shift to making the case or a more pleased tone, or I might be switching to a more upset tone based on the criteria. That would be an example of a shift in neutrality. Both of these can be analyzed the same way you analyze any choice. Essentially, what you're doing is explaining why did the tone change and what was the effect on the purpose or the audience. Let's start out with a short example passage. As I read, see if you can identify where the tone shifts. What is the tone at the beginning, whereas what is the tone at the end? Out behind the University of Tennessee Medical Center is a lovely forested grove with squirrels leaping in the branches of hickory trees and birds calling and patches of green grass where people lie on their backs in the sun, or sometimes in the shade, depending on where the researchers put them. This pleasant Knoxville hillside is a field research facility, the only one in the world dedicated to the study of human decay. The people lying in the sun are dead. So you probably noticed a change. If I was doing an analysis of tonal shift on this passage, I would say that it shifts from a joyful tone to a blunt tone. Here's why. At the beginning of the passage, it talks about a lovely forested grove, squirrels leaping in hickory trees, birds calling, a very idyllic picture. The author's attitude towards this is joyful or pleased, right? Then, however, we see the reality of the situation because at the end it switches to a very blunt tone by expressing that these people are not just sitting and enjoying a day in the sun. In fact, they're dead bodies. What I would do is I would analyze why this shift occurs. It might be for humor, it might be for some other purpose, but that would be an example of analyzing tonal shift. As promised, I'd like to show you how I would approach a passage to identify all these different types of rhetorical choices. Pause this video, and in the description, you'll find a link to an annotation model in which I show you how to identify all three types of choices. So far in the video, our goal has been to identify these different types of rhetorical choices. In the remainder of the video, I'd like to talk you through how I would analyze different choices using those examples from the annotation model. Before we start to analyze individual rhetorical choices, it's important that we assess the rhetorical situation of the letter, primarily so that we know what the overall purpose is. Because again, our goal in a rhetorical analysis is to identify how each individual choice is supporting that purpose. So what I did is created a quick rhetorical triangle diagram of the letter in the annotation model. First of all, we have Abigail Adams, former First Lady of the United States, and she's talking to her son, John Quincy Adams, who will also become president one day. And she's talking about a trip to France with his father. The provided context, I think that's relevant to this, is that his father is a diplomat at the time, as well as future president, and we are living in post-American Revolution time. From these things, I was able to determine that the purpose was to convince him to make the most of this trip to France. He's clearly hesitant, which she acknowledges in the very beginning of the letter, but ultimately she wants him to walk away from this experience better than he started. So that is kind of our overall summary of the rhetorical situation for the annotation model's passage. So once we've assessed the rhetorical situation to identify the purpose, we can then identify the most effective choices made in the passage and explain their intended effect or how those choices achieve that overall purpose. So one structural choice that I identified in the annotation model was the use of compare and contrast. This occurs when Abigail Adams is comparing a traveler to a river. When I think about it, the effect of that choice was to illustrate how John Quincy's own journey will improve his qualities, just like a river gains those rich veins of minerals from traveling downstream. So again, I've identified the choice, which is the use of compare and contrast. And then I've brainstormed to think about what is the effect. In this case, she's illustrating for him how his own journey to France is going to also enrich him, just like a river that goes downstream. So once we've identified the choice and its intended effect, we can compose a body paragraph in which we analyze the rhetorical choice. These body paragraphs would become the body of your question 2 essay. Each paragraph should develop a claim in which you identify a choice and its effect. So let's break down my example, starting with the claim. Adams compares her son's journey to a river flowing downstream to illustrate how his trip to France will improve his qualities. In this claim sentence, I've identified the choice, the comparison, as well as the effect, which is to illustrate how the trip to France will improve his qualities. This is an example of an explicit and effective rhetorical analysis claim. Let's move on to the evidence. The paragraph then goes on to provide its evidence. Just like a river gains rich veins of minerals from traveling downstream, Adams is arguing that her son will also grow and gain new qualities from this experience. In this particular sentence, I've used a direct quote to illustrate where this appears in the passage. The rest of the paragraph is commentary. She makes this comparison between him and a river in order to prove to him that the trip is worthwhile because he was not eager to go. She is trying to highlight what he has to gain from the experience. So in the commentary, my entire goal was to explain how does this use of comparison specifically achieve her overall purpose of convincing him to make the most of this trip. A second choice I identified in my annotation was allusion or reference, in particular, a reference to the famous orator Cicero. And for me, the effect of this choice was to illustrate how greatness is born of adversity for John Quincy Adams, because Cicero grew to greatness by facing his enemies or challenges. So in other words, Abigail Adams is saying that Cicero was great because he faced challenges or did things he didn't want to do. Similarly, John Quincy will be great by doing something he doesn't want to do, which is go to France. On the next slide, I have my full paragraph in which I've developed my analysis of this choice. Pause the video to copy it down or take a screenshot. Then I'd like you to identify the claim, the evidence, and the commentary. You can do this by highlighting, underlining, or using brackets. But the goal is to see if you can identify where my claim is, where my evidence is, and where my commentary is. When you're ready to check your answers, resume the video. For the third choice, I'd like you to practice analysis on your own. In my annotation model, I identified that Abigail Adams develops a proud tone near the end of her letter to John Quincy Adams. Below, I've also provided the effect. For me, I think the purpose of that was to evoke a sense of duty in her son so that he will make the most of his trip abroad. In your notes, go ahead and write a body paragraph just like the two samples we looked at. In it, develop a claim, provide evidence, and commentary in which you explain and analyze this rhetorical choice. And there you have it. Overall, analyzing rhetorical choices is a very complex skill that takes time to master. This is just a quick introduction. On the next slides, I have some review questions to help you review some of the content we went over. But ultimately, learning how to analyze rhetorical choices comes to practice and exposure. So the more you practice, the better. Thanks, everyone.